Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm happy to have you here in my session. I'm Dr. Leo Borne from Brazil, and I'm going to present to you some results on my current research. Let's share some screen here. As I said, I'm Leo Borne. I am from the Federal University of Mato Grosso in the center of South America. And I work as a co-leader at the research group Music Education. Let's get going. Well, the title of my presentation, as you can see, is Music Assessment, a Scope Review. Well, some introduction. I have a special interest in this subject because I love assessment. That is also why I have done my doctoral thesis about assessment on music theory classes. And then I started to think, because of my empirical knowledge about this literature, this Brazilian literature, I started to think, well, we don't have lots of things published in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese, about music assessment. But is that right? I could only recount for two books on music assessment that were published in Brazil. And those books are those two that are appearing in the screen, the Avaliação em Música, Reflexões em Práticas from Hentic and Souza, and also por Todos ou Todos por from Tourinho e Braga. In this sense, it was very interesting to design a study aiming to build a broader view of how music assessment is addressed in Brazilian music journals. So, this paper shows partial results of this study and focus on A, how, who is publishing about music assessment, B, where and when, and C, what and who is being assessed or focused on. To achieve this object, I have designed this research, and I'm going to present the methodology followed. So I conducted a scope review throughout the main Brazilian music journals, and this was done in November 2012. The inclusion criteria for the journal were if that the journal was an open source, the journal was available online, and if they had an ESSN number. This was because some Brazilian journals do not have this number that is very important to say that the journal is a valid one. Well, as for the paper compilation, in most cases, in all cases, I use the word avaliação, that means both assessment and evaluation in Portuguese. And I entered this word in the search engine of the journal, including title, abstract, keywords, and full text. Nevertheless, some journals did not have this search engine implemented. So I started to go through all the papers that were published there. Let's get going to some results. Well, the first compilation that I did returned a total of 223 papers, but some of these papers usually mention assessment just mention assessment, did not focus on assessment. So I did some refinement and I discarded those papers that were not good for this research. And after this refinement, I had a total final number of 40 papers. As you can see, for instance, the journal Musicology, I compiled 69 papers, but in the end, I used only two of them. Following that, I started to see some demographic numbers about these papers. And I started to read those, of course, and I was aware that the papers showed a total number of 44 authors in the 40 papers, but five of them that are França, Cecilia França, Borne, that is myself, Regina Santos, that was my doctoral advisor, Rosane Araújo, and Viviane Bainick, we were responsible for a total of 39% of all papers. And this suggests that Brazil has not an academical book corpus of researchers who dedicated their studies to music assessment, because most of the studies were conducted by those five researchers. Second, uh, I gathered that 16 journals published papers on music assessment, and the Revista da ABEM, ABEM is the National Association for Music Education, almost like an AFME from the United States, and the AFME accounts for 30% of all papers, which is expected, given that this journal is the only is the specific journal that focus on music education. The other journals encompass broader music subjects such as performance, composition, musicology, etc. So it is expected that the Rabin uh, journal was responsible for most of the papers, and this is a portrait of the journal. Well, also I started to see the date of the publication, and all of the papers, all of the 40 papers were published from 2000 to 2012 in a almost equal distribution, as you can see in this table. We do not have a peak. Well, we have a little peak here in 2016, but that's not very true. Uh, for me, it does not show an increased interest on music assessment. Going to some content analysis, uh, 60% of the papers described, validated, or problematized either performance or music theory assessment. It's interesting to notice that other 25% of the papers brought up conceptualizations, perceptions on music assessment. And these conceptualizations and perceptions usually through the lens of the teachers and the undergraduate students. When the papers did mention who was assessed, um, usually the public were undergraduate students, and in the papers there were 43 mentions of who was being assessed, and 15 of them were for undergraduate students, followed by children with 7 out of 43 papers. Also, it's important to highlight a specific paper that focused on music assessment with children within the autism spectrum. And lastly, we can say that how, when the papers did mention which tool they were using to assess, that means how, most than 50% of the papers, we had 21 mentions, and out of this 21, 12 mentioned tests and exams, which seems that assessment is still carried out and connected to a tool that is largely controversial when conducting the whole process, because this paper were linking tests as a synonymous of assessment. Well, in conclusion, and in an open conclusion, because this is a topic that I'm very interested in, we have a very good sample of papers, because out of lots and lots of papers, I would think that I would have like 10 papers, but I had 40 papers. And because of that, even with a good sample of papers, Brazilian research on music assessment yet is an unexplored field to scholars and teachers. And because of that, the subjects and public cover of this research compiled is very narrow. We only seen children, we only seen undergraduate students. How about teacher assessment, teaching assessment, curriculum assessment, programs assessment, institutional assessment? What about that? Thus, we suggest that scholars and the National Association for Music Education should endeavor further actions to address music assessment, both in the research field and also in the praxis field. Well, that was all that I had to share with you. I hope that you had a great time. I'm here if you want to share some thoughts. This is my email that you can write me, and I'm happy and looking forward to see you in the synchronous sessions about the papers. Thank you very much.